the politicians and establishment figures in the United States and European Union demanding that the West accept millions of Middle Eastern refugees are the same globalists that created the tragic situation in the first place by destroying the countries their victims are fleeing from. Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond all offer plenty of evidence showing that to be the case. The horrific consequences of the globalist establishment's machinations, though the genocide of Middle Eastern Christians, the emergence of savage terror groups such as the Islamic State, ISIS, that tsunami of refugees right now cascading into Europe, and more are only just beginning. Whether deliberately supporting Islamic terrorist groups and leaving the Middle East in ruins was calculated to produce the tidal wave of suffering refugees remains unclear at this point. It is certainly not far-fetched, considering the decades of globalist and communist support for terrorism, tyranny, and even mass murder, often as a means to an end. But the fact that the Obama administration, the U.S. government, the United Nations, the EU, European national governments, and allied Sunni-Arab dictators created these crises is beyond dispute. So is the fact that they are exploiting the disasters they created to advance multiple agendas, as the New American has been documenting for years. While the establishment press appears to be counting on its dwindling audience having a short memory, the true source of the refugee crisis has not escaped notice entirely. The reason so many are fleeing places such as Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, and Iraq is that US and European interventionist foreign policy has left these countries destabilized with no hopes of economic recovery, explained former congressman and three-time presidential contender Ron Paul, a leading voice for a constitutional, non-interventionist U.S. foreign policy. This mass migration from the Middle East and beyond is a direct result of the neocon foreign policy of regime change, invasion, and pushing democracy at the barrel of a gun. In Paul's latest column, published by the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity he leads, the longtime champion of non-interventionism and liberty expressed sympathy for the displaced people, particularly the children. But, noting that very little attention was being given to the events that led to the mass displacements, Paul urged readers not to forget that this is a man-made crisis and it is a government-made crisis. In addition to the warmongers in Washington, D.C., Paul, whose son Senator Rand Paul, R.K., is now running for the GOP presidential nomination, also quite properly assigned some of the blame to European governments. Especially responsible are authorities in the United Kingdom and France, which enthusiastically supported the lawless war on Libya and later, the half-baked Assad must-go policy. As often happens when there is blowback from bad foreign policy, the same people who created the problem think they have a right to tell us how to fix it while never admitting their fault in the first place, Paul continued. As an example, he pointed to disgraced General David Petraeus, who led the CIA when the administration launched its unconstitutional regime change plot against Syria, and the former general's recent suggestion that the Obama administration forge a formal alliance with al-Qaeda to fight ISIS. Here is the real solution to the refugee problem: stop meddling in the affairs of other countries, Paul concluded. Embrace the prosperity that comes with a peaceful foreign policy, not the poverty that goes with running an empire. End the empire. Estimates on the number of refugees flooding into Europe vary widely, but hundreds of thousands have already arrived in recent months, and millions more are expected, with no end in sight. From overcrowded boats leaving from Libya stuffed with refugees to human trains of misery arriving on foot from Syria and Iraq through Turkey and other nations, the tide of displaced people is growing larger by the minute. Of course, some refugees come from other nations without ongoing crises and are simply ditching their identities and claiming to be Syrian to obtain asylum in the West. But the overwhelming majority of the refugees heading into Europe and being resettled in the United States by the UN and Obama come from a handful of nations that share one common trait: destruction and bloodshed wrought by recent interventions by Western globalists under some false pretense. From the unlawful EU-Obama Al-Qaeda war on Libya, purportedly authorized by the UN Security Council, to the destruction of Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan by globalist Western governments and their terrorist proxies, the intensifying refugee crisis has the establishment's fingerprints all over it. In fact, it is hardly a secret, with several top US officials even admitting publicly that Obama's anti-ISIS coalition had actually created, armed, and funded ISIS. Al-Qaeda, too, received a great deal of support from the Obama administration in its war on apostate Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, and later, apostate Syrian autocrat Bashar al-Assad, so much support that many senior U.S. military officials and experts have concluded that Obama switched sides in the terror war. Most of the Syrians and Iraqis fleeing their homeland, of course, are fleeing from ISIS. And according to Vice President Joe Biden, ISIS is the product of Obama's anti-ISIS coalition. What my constant cry was that our biggest problem was our allies. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens, thousands, of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight, Biden said in a speech at Harvard. Except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Those terrorists went on to become ISIS, Biden admitted after exposing Obama's false claims about allegedly moderate forces being supported in the fight against Assad. There was no moderate middle, he said. Military leaders have also alluded to the anti-ISIS coalition's role. When asked in Senate testimony whether any major U.S. allies supported ISIS, for example, U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Martin Dempsey noted that it is even worse than that. "I know major Arab allies who fund them," he responded. Senator Lindsey Graham, R-S.C., a leading warmonger and proponent of the very policies that produced the ongoing chaos, was taken aback by the response. But what Dempsey said was hardly a secret. This magazine and other sources had been reporting that for over a year, and the notion that Graham did not know borders on the ridiculous. More recently, a 2012 document from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency makes clear that the globalist-backed revolution against Assad was actually a holy war being led by Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, and other jihadist terrorists from the start, and that the Obama administration knew that very well, but violated U.S. law to support the establishment-orchestrated uprising anyway. The dear document also highlights the fact that the West and its Sunni Islamic dictator allies were supporting those same terrorist forces, and that they wanted to see the rise of a fundamentalist Islamic State in parts of Syria to destabilize Assad. The West, Gulf countries, the Islamic regimes ruling Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, etc., and Turkey support the Syrian opposition, the document explains, adding that Al-Qaeda and other terrorists are the major forces driving the insurgency against the Syrian despot. There is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist, fundamentalist Islam, principality in eastern Syria, Hasaka and Diaza, and this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want, in order to isolate the Syrian regime. Emphasis added. Of course, that is exactly what happened when ISIS declared the establishment of its caliphate in eastern Syria and parts of Iraq during its war on Assad and his allies. The report also warns of the potential consequences, though there is no mention of the ongoing genocide against Middle Eastern Christians facilitated by those same policies. The exodus of hundreds of thousands of Syrians into Europe was also not contemplated in the document, but it is certainly a direct consequence of the policies pursued by the Obama administration and its allies. Apparently military officials warned the administration against backing terrorists in Syria, but the White House proceeded anyway. Ironically, perhaps, deposed Libyan strongman Gaddafi once boasted of the Islamic presence in Europe and its potential eventual results. "We have 50 million Muslims in Europe," he said. "There are signs that Allah will grant Islam victory in Europe without swords, without guns, without conquest, and will turn it into a Muslim continent within a few decades. Thanks in part to the lawless war to overthrow him by Obama, Al-Qaeda, and European governments, that prospect is becoming increasingly less far-fetched. And all of it was based on lies and a UN resolution, with Obama never bothering to seek permission from Congress as the Constitution demands. Today, after the regime change plot turned Libya into a terror state embroiled in civil war, Libyan Muslims are fleeing to Europe by the shipload. As Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban recently warned, talk of how many Middle Eastern refugees to accept based on a proposed EU quota system is beyond futile, while the continental regime cannot even secure its outer borders. Plus, there will be consequences to allowing millions more Muslim refugees to settle in Europe, he warned, citing, among other concerns, the threat to Western civilization's Christian heritage. Plus, many European governments are already overwhelmed economically and facing massive unrest, with the incoming wave of refugees set to intensify existing crises. The mushrooming refugee crisis would appear to be yet another perfect illustration of the establishment's age-old problem-reaction-solution scam. In essence, the same figures who created a problem exploit the public reaction to it before offering their solutions, almost always involving more tyranny. Obama's former chief of staff alluded to the scam when he said, "You never let a serious crisis go to waste," and what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things you think you could not do before. Now the world is watching it play out on television. Resettling millions of non-Western refugees in the West, as is happening right now, would never have been possible without creating the initial problems. But it will have major implications stretching generations into the future. In some parts of Europe, that is already becoming impossible to ignore. Jihadists are openly bragging about their infiltration of the West among the refugees. And it may all be inevitable at this point, with European governments claiming to be unable to contain the human tsunami at their borders. At the very least, though, Americans and Europeans must hold accountable the individuals who unleashed the bloodbath in the first place by waging illegal wars and variously backing dictators and terrorist groups under the guise of foreign policy. And that accountability should start at the very top, from Obama and EU leaders on down.